Hello and good evening. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan.
Welcome to Consider This, the show where we want you to consider and then reconsider what you know of the news of the day. UMNO held its General Assembly on the weekend, where political watchers were looking out for indications of the dynamics within the party and how it would position itself ahead of the next general election. Joining us first up on the show, we have Bridget Welsh. She's with the Asia Research Institute at the University of Nottingham, Malaysia. Bridget, good evening. So let's begin the conversation with your main takeaways from the recently concluded General Assembly.
I think there are three things that are really important. The first of all, that it was an assembly for Zahid. In the sense that he defined the agenda. The court cluster in particular was directing what was happening, and I think as a consequence, those that are interested in staying with Bersatu were completely annihilated from the discussion. They were pushed out. And so in that court cluster, you saw a decision that was made against sticking with Bersatu. The second big thing that happened is that you see a situation where they have now also indicated their relationship with PAS is in trouble, that they're pushing PAS to make a decision to either stick with them or with Bersatu, and as a consequence, they're actually indicating that they will not take an alliance unless it's one on their terms. Mm-hmm. And this is the third thing that came out of the assembly, is that UMNO basically feels that it deserves the position to take over government. They haven't left that mold behind, and they were clearly indicating what they will do it no matter what, on their own or with people on their terms.
Bridget, can we look at the dissenting voices for a second? I said they were essentially sidelined. Thinking of Shahidan Kassim in Perlis and others, do you think it's reasonable to dismiss them? Are they a spent force, or could they somehow organize and maybe even split the party in some ways?
I think what's clear is that the cluster that was favoring working with Muhyiddin's government, working with Bersatu, just doesn't have the grassroots. And I think that this is something that has really become evident from the AGM this weekend. And as a consequence, the only sort of responses that they can take afterwards is to rely on Bersatu or the government to make decisions in terms of favoring a kind of extension of their tenure. Right. And I think in some of them, in particular, Anwar Musa, he's being pushed out of the party. And I think that was made very clear by the derogatory language that was used against him. And I think even Shahidan faced boos from the assembly. So I think that there are real trouble for those individuals because they don't have the same base as Zahid and the others in the party, the leadership of the party. Right. And I think, you have to understand that the base is upset at Bersatu because Bersatu has not given them face. It hasn't. It's tried to steal its members, and I think that there is a number of kind of actions that have been taken that have really soured the relationship. That's beyond the fact of UMNO being in charge. It's more about how UMNO has been disrespected as a party, and I think many in the grassroots really feel that this decision had to be made to separate UMNO from Bersatu to move in a different direction.
Bridget, maybe you can explain a little bit more about these terms that I've been hearing, and you mentioned, the court cluster, and there are many different clusters now in the time of COVID. There's a court cluster that I think refers to a group of UMNO leaders facing graft charges. There's also been talk about a cabinet cluster that, the dissenting voices. In those types of clusters within UMNO, Bridget, where do you see I guess, influence and power lie?
Well, I think the party is, this was the General Assembly. So what we see is the grassroots and the delegates from the grassroots. And I think in this context, Zahid is president and obviously the leader of the court cluster because he himself is facing charges. And as a consequence, his leadership in long term is also under very significant scrutiny. But I think the his control of the grassroots being president was pretty evident in how it's his decision that he's been pushing for to remove and separate from Bersatu. And I think it's been supported by other leaders in the party, including Tokmat Muhammad Hassan, the deputy, as well as Tunku Rizali, who has long pushed for kind of a different position. And even Najib Tun Razak has actually been making these sort of indications for the wanting to separate. And so these leaders came together, and they control the grassroots. The cabinet cluster, people like Hishamuddin Hussein, Khairi Jamaluddin, Anwar Musa, and others, there are 9 ministers in cabinet. There are 5 deputy ministers. They don't have the same clout inside the party. And I think many of them are going to have to make key decisions of when they are going to leave the government and whether or not they'll stay to the very end. And that is something they will have to decide for their own political future in terms of where they want to, whether they defect to Bersatu or to stick with UMNO. And I think those are going to be very difficult choices that they're going to have to make.
Bridget, do you think the calculus on which all this is being made, the ability for UMNO, together with Barisan Nasional, to actually win handsomely at the next general election is correct? I mean, in terms of the analysis, we heard, discussions about Pago and whether the current Prime Minister will be able to hold Pago. He did as an UMNO politician. Can he do so as a Bersatu politician? Do you think that calculus is reasonable?
Well, I think that there is a real intensive battle for the Malay heartland taking place. And this is not just about the elites, which we've seen so far. Now the calculations in terms of election involves how they're engaged with the Malay heartland. And so UMNO relies on 3 things. The first thing it relies on is its grassroots base. And there's no question, out of all the Malay parties, including PAS, UMNO has the biggest grassroots and base. And it counts on that for it to win the seats that it's won and to be able to position itself in advantages and seats that Bersatu won. For example, Langkawi, as well as Pago, as just mentioned. The second thing that UMNO feels is that it has a brand name. A brand name in the Malay heartland. And that brand name in the urban areas is very different than the brand name in the Malay heartland. And I think that they use that to their advantage. And the third factor is that there is now a recognition within UMNO that Bersatu has a liability in terms of its deliverable, in terms of the economy, in terms of the conditions on the ground. And so the calculations have been made that Bersatu is not helping UMNO. Being in government is not helping UMNO. It's actually hurting the party. And Bersatu going after its membership and after its base has not endeared itself to UMNO. So as a consequence, these 3 factors have actually pushed UMNO to take a different calculus in terms of its political orientation.
Okay, well, that's quite interesting. One of the 3 things that you pointed out at the very beginning of our conversation, one of the 3 main takeaways, you said number 2 was the relationship with PAS, between PAS and UMNO is now in trouble. And I wanted to cite a tweet by PAS Secretary General Datuk Seri Taqiyuddin Hassan, very cryptic tweet where, if I may translate it, he said, "I may have lost someone who didn't love me, but you lost someone who truly loved you." And assuming he was talking about a political relationship, Bridget, could you help decode what you think this means?
Well, I think, all these discussions of divorce, first wife, second wife, how many wives can you have? These are issues that are being, portrayed in terms of the discussion. I think, the reality is PAS and UMNO have been political opponents for many, many decades. I think their move together after, Pakatan Harapan won in 2018 was a calculated move to shore up its base. And in this context, we see a situation where PAS, uses this idea of bringing the Malay community together as its kind of reasoning for making the connection to Bersatu and to UMNO. And I think that, and it's on those grounds that we see this tweet. This tweet is saying, "Hey, you're actually, moving away and dividing the Ummah, hurting the Malay community," and as a consequence, we see comments like like this. They said they really loved you. Well, in fact, you know, I don't know what sort of love this was, but it was one that was very much calculated on a calculus that they have been using as part of their ideological orientation to sort of reposition the party and position the party as a national party for its own purposes. And they believe that they can do this through an alliance relationship, and they've been very successful in strengthening their hand in this regard.
Bridget, this rhetoric of Malay unity, now the gap between that and the reality of political parties in a competitive system, what do you think will be the takeaway from the grassroots, the rank and file? I mean, were they always very pragmatic? Was the rhetoric always there merely as a guide, merely as a way to deploy, you know, or to mobilize support in particular critical moments? Are they true believers in Malay unity among the political parties that would actually make the compromises necessary to come together?
I think the situation has evolved since 2018, that they see that the Malay unity as being a strength. They recognize that the three-party contests really hurt both PAS and UMNO, and in some ways, you know, as a consequence, they know that being together as a unit is stronger. But of course, in this context, they define their opponents as being non-Malays. And in the reality of politics in Malaysia, you have to work with Sabah and Sarawak, and you need non-Malay support in the peninsula to govern. And even if you do the calculus in terms of winning all the Malay seats, you still need to have some cooperation with non-Muslims. But this rhetoric comes from that particular period of time, and it's been building for a long time before that. And I think it is tied into an agenda that wants to kind of redefine the political landscape in terms of issues of religion, issues of race, and I think it has a different type of trajectory, and we've seen that already in the UMNO General Assembly being contested. So, for example, PAS has been arguing for Sharia law for many decades, and we see now UMNO saying that they will defend that. And of course, here's the situation that politically that PAS faces, that they're in a government where they were part of it and they were not able to deliver it. So in this consequence, it actually weakens them within the context of Bersatu. And UMNO is being very calculating in actually pushing PAS on these sets of issues and showing, hey, wait a minute, you know, you're not being together this way and being with these actors does not necessarily benefit the Malay community as they're defining it in a broader way in terms of their conceptualization of Sharia law.
Bridget, great perspectives. Thank you so much for joining us on the show tonight. We appreciate your insights. Thank you. We're going to take a quick break here on Consider This, but more on the UMNO General Assembly in just a couple minutes. Stay tuned.
Semua yang terjadi adalah berita, tetapi tiada siapa yang boleh bawakan yang terkini dan tergempar seperti kami.
Dilihat hanya memberi wang tanpa matlamat yang tepat. Dia tidak melakukan apa-apa kesalahan.
Untuk mendapatkan jawapan yang bermakna, kita perlu soalan yang tepat.
Amat sedih dengan apa yang berlaku ke atas.
Tiada ruang untuk berita palsu.
Negara kita telah merekodkan kes harian baru sebanyak
hanya fakta yang diberikan.
Amat penting untuk meneruskan perjuangan negara melawan pandemik ini.
Sentiasa memastikan suara anda, suara rakyat didengari.
Kenapa?
Membawakan apa yang penting di mana sahaja anda berada.
Kerana kita hendak putuskan rantaian jangkitan.
Belanjawan dan pendekatan bertimbangkan survival ini secara keseluruhan.
Teruskan bersama kami, Astro Awani, saluran berita yang paling dipercayai rakyat Malaysia.
Kini berwajah baru.
Ini pula susulan khas pesawat Back Air di Kazakhstan. Pesawat berkenaan dilaporkan tergelincir 2 kali.
Notifikasi berita terkini dan navigasi mudah. Podcast dikemas kini dengan berita dan program
Rebirth, Reformasi, Resistance and Hope.
Serta video tanpa had dengan scroll tanpa henti. Buat turun aplikasi baru Astro Awani sekarang.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Dalam kita berusaha memutuskan rantaian wabak ini, kita jangan terpedaya dengan virus maklumat palsu. Simak fakta melalui www.astroawani.com atau aplikasi Astro Awani. Teruskan berdisiplin, ratakan lengkungan pandemik ini.
The third wave of COVID-19 has taken us by storm. There's no room to take anything lightly. Everyone must follow all the steps to stop the spread of COVID-19. Social distancing, face masks, follow these steps, this SOP with the utmost discipline. Together, we can flatten the curve.
Bila sentuh soal berita, tiada masa untuk tunggu. Kepada anda kami bawakan fakta, susulan dan kupasan yang terkini. Tiada drama dan tiada pengulangan. Usah tunggu lama-lama. Awani 7.45 lebih awal dari biasa.
News is a constant. Whatever the time, wherever you are, it will reach you. What's key are its credibility and accuracy. Without bias, with context covering all angles. This is what you'll get on Awani Tonight. We'll brief you the news and views of the day that matter, all in 15 minutes. Weekdays at 9:45 p.m. only on Astro Awani.
Perang COVID-19 masih belum berakhir. Pastikan setiap langkah berjaga-jaga diamalkan, termasuk kebersihan tangan, pemakaian pelitup muka dan penjarakan sosial. Marilah kita sama-sama hapuskan virus ini sepenuhnya. Ayuh berdisiplin.
Us now, we have the Executive Director of Merdeka Center, Ibrahim Sufiano, better known as Ben. Ben, so for many of us, myself included, the most interesting thing coming out from the UMNO General Assembly was when UMNO President Zahid Hamidi stated quite conclusively in his opening assembly speech, no Bersatu, no Anwar and no DAP. Now I'm wondering, was that the most interesting for you that came out of the General Assembly over the weekend?
I think what's interesting for is towards the end when many speakers sit their piece. And the Deputy President of the party said issued an ultimatum for a decision to be made by August this year because it sort of draws a line in the sand about the extent to which the differences in politics and this dynamic will see a good whether or not to stay coalition or they pull out once the emergency is over. So I think that gives a date for us to look at whether or not they mean what they said during the entire assembly.
Ben, it seems to me that the issue of the long game, or the game at the end game, as it were, for UMNO has been for the last year to, in fact, get the government to go to an election as soon as possible. And if that's correct, is it based on their assumption that they will do well at the next general election, and they will do well even if they're not in a coalition with a Bersatu? Is that, from your sense, is that a position that holds water, that can be supported by evidence, that UMNO will do well at the next general election, part of Barisan Nasional?
Well, it's something that they are hoping that they will do better. They believe that they will do better by themselves, even in a three-corner contest, where they will be able to take back the seats that they lost during the election, as well as win back the seats whose MPs had defected over to Bersatu. I think to understand the thinking within UMNO and leadership right now, and the reason why they wish to pull away from this coalition is to look at the general political real estate. UMNO contested something like upwards of 90 in the last election, and then they won around 60 seats, roughly speaking, 59. And since then, many MPs have defected over to Bersatu, leaving them with less than 40 MPs. And those that are currently UMNO MPs also have their question. So I think for UMNO, first and foremost, whether they win or do not do so well, in the election is that they do not wish to share the parliamentary seats with PAS and also Bersatu in an election setting, because that will just reduce that to become a very small, perhaps, regional party. And I think the UMNO leaders who spoke over the weekend speak of an UMNO that's going to cover the lost ground. So they will try to win back the lost territories, and they need to do so without the participation of other hangers-on, meaning there's no space for Bersatu, there's no space for PAS, because UMNO needs all the seats it can get to contest in the election. Right. The second part is whether or not they can do well in an election, if an election is called. I think there's some thinking within UMNO that it cannot be worse than 2018. I think that remains to be seen. You know, right now, we can only surmise from surveys and analysis to see whether UMNO will do worse or better off compared to 2018. A lot of it depends on UMNO itself. Will UMNO be able to push forward a new set of leaders, younger leaders perhaps, more dynamic leaders, or will the same characters that were fielded in 2018 and some controversial leaders still remain in the field? And I think we are, looking at UMNO that's facing the crossroads and have to decide whether or not they can change in order to recover the lost ground.
Well, Ben, sorry to interrupt you, but on that note, how UMNO will decide, Anwar Musa did say that it is it's in the hands of the UMNO delegates how they're going to go forward. And I want to cite a Merdeka Center survey that you guys did in January that found that a reflection of the current sentiment within UMNO. And whether this is what we will see. Will the leaders truly respond to what the grassroots sentiment is within the party?
There is a dichotomy between the average Malay voter that wants to see a Malay-dominant coalition rule the country and the people within the UMNO hierarchy, people from the party president all the way down to the Ketua Cawangan, the branch leaders in the respective constituencies across the country. There is a big dichotomy there. People within the structure, I think, want to see UMNO take back the seats that they have lost in the election, and they want to see the party come back to power and supply the Prime Minister that runs government in the future. Average Malay voters, out there on the street, they want to see a dominant Malay party that rules over, that presides over a multi-ethnic coalition. So most people continue to want to see the multi-ethnic coalition, but with the dominant Malay party that has the final say, a organization that's rooted in the realities of politics today. And I think the UMNO that we see convened over the weekend is one that's trying to find the space for, number one, to allow the party leadership to consolidate his hold over the party, and number two, to set the agenda forward. And in order to force the Prime Minister to call for an election very soon. And number three, to push the discussion towards the future of the party under the current set of leadership. And therefore, avoid the messy discussion about the controversies that they're embroiled in and whether or not the current leadership really can bring about the support from the general Malay population. So the whole discussion about Sharia, I think I agree with our previous speaker that it is meant to put a foil on PAS, to put pressure on PAS that they have not been able to deliver on their Sharia promise despite being in government. And there's a number of issues that has happened over the last several weeks, which I think is going to put PAS on the back foot, on the defensive, to answer to its Malay constituency, including the Kalimah Allah issue.
Ben, I'm wondering, all these conversations are being had at the highest level of the party. We're also looking at, federal issues, but should we be looking at the state level? Because, UMNO chapters have espoused very differing approaches. If you have, you've seen statements that UMNO will cooperate with Bersatu in some states like Sabah and Perlis, although Perlis has recanted this stance since. And then, if you look at Perak and Johor, UMNO leaders have clearly said that they will not work with Bersatu. Should we be looking at, at the state level, a more granular look at how these party cooperation is going to pan out?
Well, I think in most political parties, the national leadership really calls the shot. because ultimately, if elections are called, the party president is going to be the one that provides the candidacy, that signs the candidacy nomination for those that's going to run for office, whether at the state election or at the parliamentary level. So state leaders can do the posturing right now to perhaps protect their own position and maintain relationship or the good relationship that they have with the current ruling coalition, and they can say all of those things. But ultimately, they will have to kowtow to the party president because they need the candidacy from UMNO. If they still want to become a candidate from UMNO, they need to be nice to its president and therefore listen to him. If not, I think many of these people will be getting messages that if you want to go with the other party, that's fine, you can go ahead and do so now.
Okay.
Ben, do you think Tan Sri Muhyiddin Yassin, both as Prime Minister as well as President Bersatu, will be worried coming out of this, watching what happened over the weekend? Are there concerns for him here?
Well, I think, he's an astute political hand. He has, decades of experience there. So I think he knows what's coming. This is not new. And in fact, perhaps this is a final realization of all the rhetoric, the dynamics, and the backroom discussions that have already taken place over the last several months. We can see the tension that took place last year, in the course of which the Perikatan National Coalition wanted to pass the national budget. We can see the stress that took place there. So I think what transpired over the weekend allowed for some realizations to take stock in terms of what's going to happen next. And so I think for this situation, it allows him to plan for the future.
Right. Ben, thank you so much for speaking with us tonight. Always a pleasure having you on the show. Thank you. That's all we have for you on this episode of Consider This. Don't forget to get the latest news and information on COVID-19 vaccine updates at astroawani.com as well as the Astro Awani app. Thank you so much for watching. I'm Melissa Idris.
And I'm Sharad Kuttan, signing off for the episode.
We'll be back with you same time tomorrow. Till then, good night.